The coronavirus is clearly the biggest issue facing humanity right now, but it's not the only one. That's because despite the corona chaos, the threat of climate change goes on, and it continues to be one of the greatest problems the world has right now. Now, while that might seem like a whole lot of bad news on top of each other, the corona crisis could actually prove to be good news for the planet. So in this video, we're going to explore the impact that COVID-19's had on the economy, and why some think that the virus's outbreak could have some environmental upsides. Before we dive in, I just wanted to remind you that we have some new pin badges up on our site, the Globe with Shoes designs. Show global unity in the face of coronavirus and climate change with our 3 Globe with Shoes pins. You can pick up any of the designs now, or all 3 for a discounted price. There's a whole load of other designs, so be sure to check out the store. It's linked down below. Now, before we get into the science and some of the environmental upsides of coronavirus, I just wanted to say that the virus is clearly still a bad thing. Despite so-called silver linings, the huge number of deaths that have already been reported and the hundreds of thousands that are projected clearly show that the virus isn't good in any way. So while we might be considering some of the positive environmental gains that have come as a result of the virus, we're absolutely not suggesting that the virus is good news, or that the gains are worth the pain and death. That said, let's take a look at the first impact the virus has made. Since the coronavirus outbreak, countries all over the world have seen their air pollution issues begin to clear up. This was first spotted in the Chinese province of Hubei, where the virus originated. As the province entered lockdown, roads emptied and factories closed, NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center observed a significant drop in the area's level of air pollution. Looking at the images from Wuhan released by NASA and the US Environmental Protection Agency, you can see a serious drop in the density of nitrogen dioxide. Now, this likely isn't entirely due to coronavirus, as the time frame does also line up with Chinese New Year, when factories close anyway. But compared to the same dates in 2019, the difference is stark. And it's not just at the epicenter of the outbreak. Across the country, NASA observed a significant drop in pollution levels, and there's clearly a difference when you compare 2020 with 2019. So significant, in fact, that an air quality researcher working for the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center told The Guardian that this was the first time I've seen such a dramatic drop-off over such a wide area for a specific event. Research from Marshall Burke at Stanford University concluded that this drop in pollution could have saved the lives of 4,000 children under the age of 5 and 73,000 adults over 70. But he does urge caution when it comes to the numbers, saying that it is clearly incorrect and foolhardy to conclude that pandemics are good for health. But the calculation is perhaps a useful reminder of the often hidden health consequences of the status quo. And it's not just China seeing pollution issues clear up. A study in Britain looked at 10 cities across the UK and found that in all of them, particulate matter was down. And the European Space Agency also found a drop in nitrogen oxide emissions across France, Spain and Italy. In fact, these changes could also mean that carbon dioxide levels in 2020 could fall for the first time since 2008, when the financial crisis limited growth and production. However, this drop would be even larger, representing a 5% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions, far higher than the 1.4% drop we experienced in 2008, and the largest decrease in 70 years. It's also something that Professor Rob Jackson of Stanford University is almost expecting, saying that he wouldn't be shocked to see a 5% or more drop in carbon dioxide emissions this year, something not seen since the end of World War II. Going on to remark that neither the fall of the Soviet Union nor the various oil or savings and loan crises in the last 50 years are likely to have affected emissions in the same way this crisis is. On top of the gains when it comes to air pollution, the quantity of greenhouse gases being released into the environment has also fallen. This fall is pretty much for the same reason, as when polluting industries like manufacturing and transport are forced to close down, the damage they cause also drops. In fact, a study by Carbon Brief found that Chinese CO2 emissions have dropped by 25% since the outbreak. These improvements in air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions come alongside a major drop in air travel across the world. As the virus spreads and countries began to close their borders, airlines were forced to cancel routes. So many routes were cancelled that ACI Europe, the European branch of the Airport Council, that reported that in the first 3 months of 2020, 67 million fewer passengers flew than in the same period in 2019. Due to the flight cancellations happening all over the world, the International Air Transport Association reported that the industry as a whole could lose $113 billion this year, which could lead to major companies being liquidated. This is obviously bad news for the economy, but from an environmental perspective, these grounded planes clearly aren't polluting the planet in the same way they normally would be. However, any gains here are likely temporary. While some airlines may go out of business, we can expect other airlines to take their place when global demand returns after the outbreak, and there's no reason to suspect that this will lead to a long-term drop in flights. And that's the problem with all of the environmental good news. It's very likely to all go back to normal once the coronavirus outbreak comes to an end. Remember earlier in the video I mentioned that in 2008 emissions dropped in the aftermath of the global recession. You'll be sad but unsurprised to hear that once the recession came to an end, the environmental damage returned. And unfortunately, it's something we can expect to happen again once the outbreak ends. This is something that environmental scientists at the University of East Anglia commented on, saying that this drop is not due to structural changes, so as soon as confinement ends, I expect the emissions to go back close to where they were. So while there may be some short-term benefits, these aren't likely to continue, and in the grand scheme of things, the silver linings are very limited. Further than that, there's the probability that in trying to restart economies, governments will actually increase pollution. This happened after the 2008 financial crisis, with countries like China spending billions on projects to kickstart the economy, giving tax credits to manufacturers and investing in infrastructure. This kind of action may be great for the economy, but it puts a serious toll on the environment, and we could see the same thing happening in the aftermath of the coronavirus, with countries polluting more than ever to get economies and businesses back on track. Even when we put aside the long-term effects, in the short term it's still not all good news from an environmental perspective, as the virus has led to some very real damage. Firstly, as people have been attempting to socially distance themselves, they've been changing their travel habits, shifting away from public transport and back to their cars. This is perfectly understandable with the virus ongoing, and many places are even reporting car usage dropping, but it could be worrying longer term. If people's habits begin to change during the outbreak, we could see public transport use fall longer term, even once the outbreak is finished. Secondly, the virus has produced large quantities of rubbish. In order to effectively treat those infected with the coronavirus, a huge amount of medical waste has been produced. In fact, Wuhan reported their levels of medical waste being 4 times higher than before the outbreak. And this waste isn't even being recycled, as contaminated items need to be destroyed rather than recycled to prevent future contamination. Even outside of hospitals, individuals are also producing more waste, with people preferring to purchase pre-packaged food to try and limit the chances of infection. However you look at it, the world is still producing huge quantities of waste despite the quarantines. Finally, with the virus getting international attention, the environment is no longer the crisis that everyone's focusing on. And while combating the virus is obviously incredibly important, some may be paying less attention to the environment during this time, which, as we've discussed, could be potentially damaging as countries try and restart their economies. So it seems that the virus has reduced the levels of pollution around the world, but it's also led to some less desirable effects. It's unlikely that the benefits will last long, as Christopher Karnaskas of the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder said, "I don't see any way that this is good news, except for proving that humans drive greenhouse gas emissions. Maybe that is the only true upside of the crisis. This reduction in emissions, pollution and environmental damage proves beyond any doubt that we can make a difference. If the world is willing to make major structural changes, we can make an even greater and longer lasting difference than the coronavirus. But whether people are actually willing to do that is another question entirely." Do you think that there are environmental upsides to all this? Do you think that post-outbreak, the world will continue to focus on climate change? Comment down below, or alternatively, you can get involved in the conversation over on Discord. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a video. You can also find more from us across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible.